What's going on, everybody? You're tuned in to BodyGeeks. So today, I'm going to give you my thoughts on the top 3 from the 2019 Classic Physique Olympia, and I'm going to answer the question, did Chris Bumstead deserve the title? Check it out. All right, everybody, before you get your panties in a bunch over my title and me telling you that I'm going to answer the question, did Chris Bumstead deserve the Olympia title, the Classic Physique Olympia title, let's go ahead and get started and just talk about the placings. So first, we had Chris Bumstead, followed by Breon Ansley, followed by George Peterson. Now, I've said it before on here and on my other social media, I am Breon's, guru or whatever you want to call it. And Chris Cormier is his trainer and posing coach. So we got a whole team. A guy named Sam also helps out. So I just want to say that because naturally I'd be biased. So you're probably thinking that I'm going to come on here and just trash Chris and say that Breon's the best. And I just want to tell you that that's not true. I'm going to give you my objective opinion on how I saw it play out. I'll give you my opinion on what I think I thought should have happened. But at the same time, I want to give you what I saw. I've been around bodybuilding a long time. Not as long as, I'm not an old man or anything, but put it this way, I've been following, this stuff for more than 10 years. So I have a decent idea of what I'm looking at. So I want to say that first, all 3 of these guys look phenomenal, and all 3 of these guys clearly deserve to be in the top 3. Now, I think that if you look at a spectrum of guys, a spectrum of these 3 guys, you have Chris being the most classic looking and George being the most bodybuilder looking. Now, it doesn't mean that Chris isn't a good bodybuilder or that George isn't a good classic guy. It's just if I have to peg them in a category, that's where they are. And I think Breon kind of falls in the middle, right? So here we go. I want to first congratulate Chris on his title. And even though it pains me to say that, because of course I wanted Breon to win. And I want to also congratulate George on his 3rd consecutive 3rd place, which I know has to sting a bit for him, as because he's not moving up, but he's not moving back. And it really was entertaining. And I think the competition between these 3 was some of the best that we saw all weekend on the Olympia. So if you would have came up to me Friday night, right after Chris was called the Classic Physique champion, and asked me what happened, I would have told you I didn't know. I would have told you I was kind of confused, that I thought that we did enough to have to win. And then I would have told you that I needed time to digest what had happened and give you my thoughts. And now here we are. So I want to say that I saw on social media, and of course I had a bunch of people texting me that support me and support Breon and, thinking that we got robbed or all this stuff. And I saw people posting online kind of the same thing, and then I would see people defending Chris, and even last year and the year before, like people have always, if their guy doesn't win, they're upset, right? So I want to point out that let's say people were upset, right? Chris's fans were, of course, happy. Breon's fans were, of course, upset. And some people were upset because they felt that Breon was a clear winner, or that even George was the clear winner. Even me personally, I thought that it was coming down between George and Breon. I actually had Chris in 3rd. And that's not me hating on Chris. That's just how I felt after prejudging, right? Going into finals. So I just want to say that it's understandable why people would be confused. And I want to try and make some light of that and try and help people understand. So I'll say this. Breon is a better bodybuilder than Chris Bumstead. Now, hang on before you get upset. Breon is a better bodybuilder than Chris Bumstead. George is a better bodybuilder than Chris Bumstead. George, in this show, you could make a very strong case that he was a better bodybuilder than Breon. But we have to remember, this is classic physique. This is not bodybuilding. Now, bodybuilding obviously plays a big part of classic physique, but we have to differentiate classic physique from 212 and open bodybuilding, and we have to recognize that there are different standards for the judging criteria in this division compared to open bodybuilding. So, I think that even those of you that are Chris Bumstead fans, I think that you need to recognize that Breon is the better bodybuilder. Now, that's not me just trying to say like Chris didn't deserve it. No, let me finish my video here before you get mad at me. Breon is a crazy good bodybuilder. That's why I'm saying that. Chris is a taller guy. Breon's a shorter guy. Most bodybuilders are shorter. I mean, like, there's a whole bunch of things I can say here. Of course, from the back, everybody wanted to point that out. Chris's weaknesses are back and biceps, right? And Breon is very complete, very symmetrical, very aesthetic, shredded from head to toe. Like, he's got so much going on. Same thing with George. And so it's not that Chris isn't lean. It's not that Chris isn't muscular. But from bodybuilding standards, Breon and George both beat Chris. From classic physique standards, you can now see why Chris could beat either one of those guys. So now that I've established that Breon and George would beat Chris if this were a bodybuilding show, but it's not a bodybuilding show and it's classic physique, I want to say why Chris ended up with the title. Now, Chris has, as we know, some deadly classic physique shots. And even him just standing still, he has an insanely classic look to him. I mean, there's a reason this guy has been second to Breon the last couple of years, right? And narrowly, he's barely lost to Breon. Just like Breon this year barely lost to him. So Breon's look and Chris's look, there's a clear message from the judges saying that both of these guys have what it takes to lead this division, to show everybody that this is the standard of classic physique. Now, you may like Chris's look, or you may like Breon's look, but you have to recognize they're both phenomenal and they're both capable of leading this division. So, Chris is absolutely deadly as a classic competitor in classic shots. He's got that look, right? Now, you have to recognize that even though he brought him up this year, I got to give him props. Like that, him and Ian, I know, worked incredibly hard, and they brought his back and biceps up, but they're still lagging. Chris has, those are kind of clear weaknesses of Chris's, but they're his only weaknesses. And obviously, classic is about a certain look, not necessarily about like bodybuilding where it's about weaknesses. So if, as bodybuilding fans, if you're watching the bodybuilding division, we can judge shows looking for a combo of muscularity, completeness, condition, all these things that we know are the clear criteria for judging. But if we take a look at pretty much all of the women's divisions, men's physique, pretty much any division that's not bodybuilding, if we take a look at how they judge those classes, we have to recognize that they're going for a very subjective look. They're not judging it based on the same criteria as bodybuilding, and because all these divisions are newer, there's not a clear-cut, solid criteria for the division like there is for bodybuilding that's been around since 1965. I mean, technically before that, but the Olympia started then. So that's how, if you're still upset that Breon lost, right? Breon, in a bodybuilding competition, smokes Chris. But in classic physique, that look that Chris has carries a lot of weight, and that's why he's so dangerous in classic physique. So I want to point out that in 2018, Breon won by 1 point, and Bumstead wasn't as good as this year. Now this year, Bumstead only won by 1 point, right? And he had a much improved look this year, and I know that Breon also had an improved look as well. So this tells me that Bumstead's classic look has always been something that the judges have wanted for the criteria in this division, but Breon has just been such a dominant bodybuilder, more so than Chris, that Chris hasn't been able to tip the scales in his favor. This year, however, Chris was a good enough bodybuilder that his strength, looking like a classic, the classic competitor, was able to tip the scales in his favor. So that tells me as a coach of Breon's that we need to classic up some of his poses and his look to try and take the title back from Bumstead. So, Breon, I think, can beat Chris when it comes to bodybuilding muscularity and all things related to bodybuilding. Chris, having placed second to Breon by only 1 point, and now narrowly beating Breon by 1 point, if we know that Chris is losing by bodybuilding standards, but he won by classic physique standards, you can see where the two kind of mesh there. So there's a subjective look to classic physique, and then you also have to mix in the typical bodybuilding standards. So for Breon to beat Chris next year, we got to classic him up a little bit, which I'm not going to give you guys our secrets, but I already got a plan. And at the same time, I know that Bumstead and his coach Ian are going to be continuing to work on Chris's back and his biceps and just his overall muscularity. I'm not saying that Chris isn't jacked as hell. I mean, the dude's jacked. But Breon has a certain look to him that's undeniable. He's got that mature, dense muscle, like the bodybuilding stuff, right? So Chris is younger. Chris will get that with time, and I know that Chris and Ian are going to work on that because if Chris's strength is a classic look, and Breon's strength is all the things related to bodybuilding, then, and it's not, I want to point out that I'm not saying that Breon doesn't have a classic look and that Chris doesn't have bodybuilding strengths. They both have both. But if I had to differentiate between the two, Breon and even George are way ahead of Chris bodybuilding standards. However, you can make the argument that Chris is well ahead of them by classic physique standards. So, looking at this as a top three, I really want to give George a big shout out and his coach Justin. We actually talked to him briefly, ran into him at Cheesecake Factory after the show, and it actually felt good to talk to those guys. Because I actually, at prejudging, when I saw him walk out and I saw him win the Arnold earlier this year, I've seen what they've been doing. I saw George and he looked phenomenal. I mean, the level of muscularity this guy has, his back, his conditioning, he's good, like the shrink wrap skin look. I mean, like they're doing something right over there. Like I said earlier, I thought that George and Breon were going to finish 1-2 at, with one winning over the other. If I thought that we had enough as the returning champion, which typically, you have to quote unquote knock out the champ. I still thought we had enough to win. Obviously, I'm biased, but let's just say I was looking at George going, man, I stayed on my game because I knew if we slipped at all, he was there, right? So I want to give him credit there. I think a lot of people have said, George should go to 212. George is too much of a bodybuilder. And I want to disagree. I want to support George a little bit. I want to say this. I think if he chooses to go to 212, he could win the 212 Olympia. I think he would have won it this year, even with his classic physique weight. He's that good. So I think that if you're going to say George should go to 212, say it because you think he would do so well in that division that he should go there. To say that he's not classic and he should go there is wrong because he clearly has a classic physique. Just it may not be that 70s style classic physique you're thinking of. It may not be the vacuum pose of, like a Bumstead. It may not be that style of classic, but to say that George isn't aesthetic and classic in his own right is foolish. He certainly is. So the way I see things, I think I personally still had Breon winning. I think that Breon has a very late 80s, early 90s look to him. And then you combine all of his bodybuilding strengths, the conditioning, the muscle separation. I mean, this guy has cross striations all over the place. He's complete, meaning he's not lagging really any body parts. So I thought, and he's the returning champ. So I thought that somebody would have to knock him out. And I personally didn't think that Chris knocked him out. Now, that said, I can see why Chris won. So I'm not upset about this. I'm not here on this video saying that we got screwed. I'm not here on this video trying to diss Chris and say that Breon should have won. My personal opinion was Breon should have won. I'm a little biased, but that's where I'm at. That said, I totally see why Chris wins. And now that he's won, I've accepted that, and I've already worked on a game plan to try and take it back from him. And I'm really looking forward to the battles between Chris and Breon, which I think will be, I think they'll be the top two guys for a while. Now, if George decides to stay in Classic, he'll certainly be right there. There's no denying that. If he ends up going to 212, he'll be my favorite 212 guy that I'm rooting for. I'll tell you that right now. Anyways, to answer the question, did Chris Bumstead deserve the Classic Physique Olympia title? Yes, he did. I can see why he won. I can see based on the criteria, the messages the judges are sending, and it's not that they changed their mind and created a new criteria this year. He was placing well before. He barely lost last year in 2018. He came better in 2019, so I can see why. He definitely deserved it. Congrats to you, Chris. Now, if you're still upset that Breon didn't win, I think that you have every right to. And here's why. You shouldn't complain. You shouldn't diss Chris. It's not his fault that you have a different opinion. I just want to point out that Chris and Breon are very close to each other, so close to each other with the judges that they're only beating each other by 1 point. So if you think that Breon should have won, there's nothing wrong with that because he only lost by 1 point, which means a lot of the judges felt the same way, right? If you think that Bumstead should have won, you are not wrong either. Clearly he won by the judges, but at the same time, by 1 point. So if you think that either one of these guys is the rightful winner, that's fine. You should. And the subjectivity in this sport is what makes it very interesting. Now, speaking of that subjectivity, I'll admit that I used to be one that I didn't like change. I liked bodybuilding the way it was. I didn't like when Men's Physique came out. I was even hesitant with Classic when it came out. I didn't like the change. I didn't like social media changing things, And I'm at the point now where I'm more open and accepting to change because change is inevitable, right? So I want to say this, that even though coming from a bodybuilding background and obviously having a guy who's a very good bodybuilder in the running, I tend to look through bodybuilding glasses at all of these. Even if I watch Men's Physique, I'm still judging them kind of based by bodybuilding standards. And I have to recognize that Men's Physique, Classic Physique, and bodybuilding are all three going to have different criteria. Now, knowing that, at first, I'll admit, we just lost. I realized kind of the new criteria, and not that I didn't kind of see it before, but it was clear as day, right? When you take a loss and you have to figure out how you lost, well, it's clear as day now, right? And I was a bit disappointed because I love my bodybuilding, and I was like, well, I want the Classic to still kind of follow on the bodybuilding guidelines. But me being more open to change, I think that really trying to analyze and figure out the subjectivity of what is Classic, right? And having to dig deep and compare it to bodybuilders in history from the golden era in the 70s clear up through the 90s, right? Before the Mass Monster era. There's a lot of classic physiques. There's a lot of people that look really good that fit that mold, which what I'm predicting will happen in the future is the top 5 for Classic could very well end up being 5 different physiques. I'll use, for example, Bumstead is probably the most famous for his vacuum, correct? I don't think that everybody looks good with the vacuum, and I don't think that a vacuum should be a required look for Classic. If you go back throughout history, there's plenty of people who have a great Classic look without hitting a vacuum. Now, Bumstead hits it well and it works for him, so clearly he should use the vacuum in his tool belt. But I don't think that somebody not hitting a vacuum or not looking good with the vacuum, I don't think that should knock him for Classic. So basically my point in all of this is that even though I'm disappointed that my athlete lost, right, that we got second, I'm actually kind of excited because I think that Classic Physique is now going to have a lot different type of physiques. And I think that that's a really cool thing. I think that from a fan's perspective, we're not going to be able to as easily identify the winners. I think that from an athlete's perspective or a competitor's perspective, that people from all sorts of strengths and weaknesses are going to blend, trying to give their version of Classic. And I think that as the division grows, I think that it's going to be very exciting to watch. So I'm already pumped for next year. Like I said, we're already planning our attack to try and get that title back from Chris. I know they're planning on keeping it. They're working hard. And I hope that my video has helped some of you realize that there's nothing wrong with being a Bumstead fan and recognizing how good Breon is. And there's nothing wrong with being a Breon fan and recognizing how good Bumstead is. And if there's one thing I'm learning with the criteria from the Classic Physique is that you better get used to seeing somebody with a different style of physique winning, right? Or getting knocked down. Next year, hey, Breon might hit some crazy Classic shots. Maybe we'll perfect the vacuum and go after Chris's most popular shot. You never know. So I think that we're going to have a very good mix of bodybuilders and that kind of classic aesthetics that everybody's been after. I still love the open guys. I think that that's always going to be the main show, and it should always be the main show on the main stage. But I'm very happy to see Classic Physique grow in the way that it is. So there you have it, guys. Does Chris Bumstead deserve the 2019 Classic Physique Olympia title? Yes, he does. I'll admit it. Even coming from Breon's camp. That said, I know what weaknesses we have to address now and what we need to change and fix. Just as when Chris was chasing Breon, these last couple of years, they knew what weaknesses they needed to improve on to be able to take that title. I know exactly what we need to do as well. So congratulations to Chris and Ian. I'm very excited about the future battles between Chris and Breon. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please don't give me too many thumbs down if you're a big Bumstead fan. You didn't actually watch the video and you just assumed that I was going to bash him, because I clearly didn't. Please give me a thumbs up, right? Thumbs up all around. Subscribe to my channel, turn on the notification, or, you know, pretty much every time you go on YouTube, just search BodyGeeks and be like, I wonder what Brandon's talking about today. So thank you for the support, and until next time, you're tuned in to BodyGeeks.